So as you rightly introduced, the topic of my presentation would be People's Histories of Christianities towards Restoring Pacific Church History. But before I proceed further, I have to make a disclaimer because I'm really nervous of addressing this topic here, particularly for a majority Pacific audience, because of my social location and identity, cultural and ethnic identity as a non-Pacific. But I take refuge in my favorite poet Khalil Gibran, who says, whose poetic lines about self-knowledge is fascinating, that gives me a kind of a strength to go ahead in my presentation. He says, "Say not, I have found the truth, but rather I have found a truth. Say not, I have found the path of the soul. Say rather, I have met the soul walking upon my path. For the soul walks upon all paths. The soul walks not upon a line, neither does it grow like a reed. The soul unfolds itself like a lotus of countless petals." So today what I'm going to share with you is one of those petals, countless petals, or the perspectives on the historiography of Christianity. And in no way I would claim, or I pray that I do not show any audacity to dictate terms for the Pacifica historians, in particular church historians in the Pacific. So I would like to share some of my perspectives on the topic, or the chosen topic, and would like to reiterate kind of a discussion and Talanova, which I'm really looking forward to. So the framework of my presentation would look like this. I will have 3 pointers. Number one, I would discuss about why do we have to see church history as a colonial construction? Is it a colonial construction? If so, why and how? Number two, what is people history, or people's histories of Christianities? Is it a decolonial approach to church history? And that would lead me to my third and last point, some possible pathways towards restoring Pacific church history. As I repeat, maybe perhaps I want to stress on the word some possible pathways, because I don't want to claim any absolute methodological framework or anything like that. And within that third pointer, I would share 3 other sub-pointers in a way of restoring Pacific church history. Number one, restoring Pacific church history as celebrating alternative and dissenting memories of the indigenous multitude. Number two, restoring Pacific church history as embodying spirit-based people stories as contrary to text or archive-based mission narratives. Number three, restoring Pacific church history as decolonial and anti-racist manifestations. So this is the framework. I will be sharing my presentation. I'll be reading from the text which I have prepared, and I hope that you will be able to follow through the slides. So number one, church history, a colonial construction. Studying history of a faith community that carries a strong colonial baggage, particularly in the global South, including the Pacific, where colonialism is manifested in a variety of forms, is not just about an academic activity required for a degree. It is a potential political tool either to legitimize and perpetuate the prevailing unjust colonial and imperial order, or to contest, to resist, and to dismantle such orders. Therefore, any desire and effort to restore or decolonize history implies that there are inherent colonial and colonized stories in the existing order and practice, and that they haunt and trouble our lives in the contemporary world. So our desire to restore church history, therefore, obviously is an indicator to the fact that we are troubled by colonial stories that are embedded in the discourse and practice of church history as an academic discipline of study. So the very nomenclature, church history, imbibes in it a set of problematics that are intrinsic for any colonial and imperial order and practice. Church history, or even if we call it history of Christianity for that matter, as an academic discipline, is conceived as the history of the church, a hierarchical, institutional, bureaucratic corporation, which is the core characteristics of a colonial system. The ways in which the study of church history is implicated in the worst extremes of colonialism remains a powerful, remembered history for many of world's colonized people, particularly in our context, the Pacifica people and communities. It is a history that still offends the deepest sense of our humanity. Therefore, it should bother us, and it should bother our spiritualities too. So if some map for the origin of this discipline called church history may be helpful, particularly for those who do not, who are not church historians here. Church history as an academic discipline came into being only the late 17th and 18th century. Because until then, there was no discipline called church history, particularly in Europe and in the Western context, because history was not separated from the history of the church. So history of the state and the history of the church were inseparable. As a result, but during the late 17th and early 18th century, during the time of Enlightenment, because of the Enlightenment ideals, religious history was separated from the so-called secular history. And when the Western was transplanted in global contexts, such as Asia, Africa, Oceania, Latin America, the discipline of church history was further divided as church history and mission history. In order to say church history is the key of Christianity in the West or in Europe, whereas the mission history is a study of the history of a Christian population in the European world, where Christianity was envisaged as a child of European missionary works. Was seen as a subordinate subject of study within the discipline of church history. So this is very problematic, and this is also a colonial construction. For example, the history of the Christian people in the Pacific was not termed in the Europe as church history, rather it was called as a subordinate subject, as a mission history. Even if you go today, particularly in European universities, I studied in Germany. If you go to Germany, any of the university, there would be two, particularly in the theological schools, there would be two different faculty. Or the church history will be the major department, which is called Kirchengeschichte. But the Missionsgeschichte, that's the mission history, would be a subordinate discipline where you will study the people, as the history of Christian people in the non-Western world or the non-European world. So that's a very construction that has to be acclimatized. And this history has been enclosed within a colonial framework. I mean mission history, or what we call church history in the non-European context, or even in the European context, which I call plan historicism. The divine plan historicism, what I mean by is mission history or the church history or the missionary activities in the colonial context were seen as divinely orchestrated plan to redeem wretched souls in the non-European context. This has been done intentionally and was enforced intentionally upon the colonized multitude to legitimize the colonial emblem of Christianity in the Indian context. To take one example from the Pacific, in the very initial pages of his first volume of Pacific History, John Garrett writes about the Western missionaries activities or about Western missionaries who came to the Pacific. He writes, the evangelical revival in Britain, coinciding chronologically with the parallel of rationalism and the scientific spirit, stress the conversion of the individual through recognition of the gravity of sin, heartfelt repentance, and trust in the self-sacrifice of Christ to restore the believer to union with God. As a result, the heart was warmed, the whole life, especially the will, felt directed again by the grace of God and the help of the Holy Spirit toward love and service of God and fellow man. This redirection sends you to the parting command of Christ, Matthew 28:19, included sharing the message of going into all the world to preach the gospel in every living creature. This is from the history book, church history book of in the Pacific, where our students use them as a key text, in fact. So this is, in fact, quite problematic, because if you carefully read this quotation or the statement, isn't it interesting that Garrett completely ignores the colonial entanglements of Christian mission? Doesn't this assertive affirmation also enforce the idea that colonialism advanced under the Western rationalism and the scientific spirit as God's will or the divine will, colonialism as divine will? To mind us, the command of Christ that Garrett mentions here, which was also popularly called as Great Commission, was never understood as Great Commission by the Christian people until 1792, in late 18th century, when William Carey, a British Baptist missionary, wrote this tract, an inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens. And for the first time, he labels this particular verse, Matthew 28:9, as the Great Commission. Till then, the Christian population did not understand this particular Great Commission. So this is a colonial, indeed a colonial construction of a divine plan historicism. Therefore, we need to see colonial construction of a divine plan historicism that legitimizes colonialism and its inextricable nexus with Christianity. And obviously, the voice of the colonized and Christianized is used as a mere appendix to support the colonial project. It either completely negates the socio-political matrix of the time or uses it to legitimize colonialism. And on the other hand, it denies the agency of the people, the colonized, the indigenous, the Pacifica people. Therefore, we have to see the need to reimagine church history beyond such colonial construction, making it the stories of the people, the multitude. So this leads me to my second pointer. People's histories of Christianities, a colonial approach to church history. Richard Horsley writes, until recently, a people's history of Christianity would have been considered a contradiction in terms according to the canons of standard history. As far as the history of church history as an academic discipline is concerned, he is right. A people's history of Christianity would have to be considered as oxymoron. As we discussed earlier, the Enlightenment thinkers who determined the subject matter, methods, and criteria of what constitutes history were struggling to get out from under the authoritarian dogma of established Christianity. Accordingly, religion was defined in restrictive ways as irrational or as a matter of individual belief. History came to be of politics, national and international. As a result, the smaller peripheral fields such as church history came into being, already said. Now, geographical methods that the church historians implied or used was exclusively an Enlightenment framework. It studied the politics of the church, its hierarchies, its triumphal stories, and so on. People, the multitudes, were either completely ignored or became appendices for the dominant stories of bishops, cardinals, popes, and the councils. And in the later, the triumphal stories of Western mission agencies in the context added these narratives. People, now multitude, continue to be the dominant narratives of church history. The post-colonial historical reconstructions, survival history projects, feminist, humanist efforts to rewriting history influenced historians and theologians on the globe, particularly in the global south, to rethink church history from people's perspective. As a result, people's history of Christianity as a collective of historians and theologians across the globe. It is envisioned to be an alternative to the church. I have a picture of three, just to give you a kind of glimpse, but there were 7 volumes in this A People's History of Christianity series. Daniel Jans, the general editor of the 7-volume series of A People's History of Christianity, in one sense, looked at church history with a difference. Church is not to be understood first and foremost as the hierarchical, institutional, bureaucratic corporation. Rather, above all, it is the laity, the ordinary faithful, the people. Requires a great deal of rethinking concerning some of the basic assumptions, approaches, and methodological standpoints of the study of Christian origins and developments, especially in the global south, and particularly in our context now in the Pacific. Writing People's History of Christianity as an alternative to the history of the church, Virginia Burrus and Rebecca Lyman wondered, what would it mean to conceive of the history of Christianity not as a history of the church, but rather as a history of Christians? This conscious effort to move away from the stories of the church to the stories of Christians or Christian people indeed attempts to decolonize the historical narratives of community centered around a hierarchical and institutional church of the privileged and elite. This interrogation compels us to make further creative interrogations to address the complexities of the nomenclature church history. Therefore, we should ask, does the word Christians really decolonize the exclusive colonial nature of the church and the Christianity? How do we define Christians after all in an indigenous context, in a Pacific context now? Does Christians mean those who subscribe to the teachings, rituals, and practices that are upheld by the institutional church? What then about those who do not want to subscribe to the teachings and practices of the church? Does the history that we are concerned about have anything to do with those who refuse to subscribe and follow the canonized teachings of the institutional church? In other words, those who understood their faith in Christ differently from the orthodox teachings of the church? What about those who did encounter Christianity in its expansionist missionary projects, but decided either not to subscribe to it or decolonize it? Has it nothing to do with the multiple aspects of a community's diverse identity, such as class, race, caste, culture, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, etc.? The divine plan historicism says no to all these questions. Therefore, we need to restory or decolonize this divine plan historical framework. So now, raising these questions, I do not intend to answer any of these here. Perhaps These questions are meant to drive us in the Pacific to take people's Christianity further and strive for multiple meanings and methods to retell the Pacifica stories of faith communities. That is why I prefer to call it Histories of Christianities, affirming the plurality of stories of faith communities in the indigenous context like that of the Pacific. With these questions, I would like to invite us to rethink and decolonize our understanding of church, Christianity, and Christians in the Pacific, while attempting to explore alternatives to restore the history of a multitude. So now I will be moving into my last pointer, the third aspect, restoring Pacific church history. What are some of the possible pathways? It is important to say a few words about the term restoring. As we know, the rewriting history projects in different contexts, particularly in the global South, have been trying to address the marginality of people and identities in the colonial narratives and attempt to reclaim their past by rewriting it from their subject experiences. Restoring in the Pacifica context is similar to such efforts, yet different in many ways. Reading and writing for the indigenous multitude have often been a borrowed and sometimes even imposed practice for a predominantly oral culture context. On the other hand, oral stories are the life vein of the indigenous communities in the Pacific. Hence, to reclaim indigenous past and present, it is inevitable to use stories, in fact, multiple stories. Reclaim effort should be seen as restoring attempts. Upoluwai elaborates the dynamics of restoring in a very detailed and compelling way. Let me use his words. He says, there are several dynamics that needs to be captured in the concept of restoring. First, the prefix re reflects revisiting, reimagining, reclaiming, repositioning, and retelling. Second, the word story encompasses many stories. Stories are at the heart of how Pacifica people theologize. The term captures the story, including stories of movements of people, bodies, things, ideas, power, and ideologies, relationships, material, immaterial, politics, economies, health and well-being, spiritualities, and cultures and languages in the Pacifica communities. It exposes stories of colonizers, both external and internal. It navigates into the stories twisted and repackaged to serve the mega story. Capitalizing yes in the word story does not mean the project proposes the only story. Rather, it means Pacifica as a diverse and distinctive region deserves to have its place alongside other stories. Third, the suffix ing implies that the colonial story is still very much alive, therefore needs living responses. It reflects that restoring needs a performative process of deconstructing old stories and reconstructing new ones. To the point of actioning and applying the newly created ones to life and well-being. It reflects the vision that any restoring is in constant motion, an ongoing process always subject to review and modification. It is never settled and rigid. In fact, this is the very nature of decentralized stories. They flow and drift from generation to generation, unquote. Keeping this clear definition in mind, here are a few possible pathways of restoring Pacific church history very quickly. Number one, restoring Pacific church history as celebrating alternative and dissenting memories of the indigenous multitude. The existing and elaborate historiography of Pacifica Christianity is enclosed by key texts produced by Western European historians and scholars. Charles Forman's The Island Churches of the South Pacific and John Garrett's 3 volumes on Christianity in Oceania, among others, have been considered as key texts in understanding the histories of Pacifica churches from the origin of Pacifica Christianity to the post-World War II period. These texts, and even later, these texts do provide a chronological history of Christianity, including the political independence of islands, churches, and the establishment of regional and national ecumenical bodies. And later, we have Manfred Ernst's book and other recent publications should be added to this. They help us understand community, Christianities, and the social matrix here. However, because of their Orientalist scaffold of historiography and the colonial archive-based research frameworks, these works negate the active agency of islanders in making their own history, and the islanders remain as mere objects of these grand historical projects. At the same time, these works also pose the challenge of misrepresentation of indigenous people, their worldviews and spiritualities. Therefore, there is a dire need to restore those representations of Christian past perspectives, listening to the silences of indigenous people within the documented historical narratives and discerning their voices in oral forms such as native art, music, dances, ceremonial celebrations, rituals, tattoos, etc., will make a distinct restoring the history of Christianity possible. The stories of indigenous people's conversion to Christianity are often portrayed as triumphal stories. This version of the past depicts pre-conversion indigenous bodies as savage, uncivilized, and wretched, which were transformed by the intervention of the benevolent Western missionaries. This is indeed a colonial construction which denies the agency of indigenous women and men in their own struggles and liberations, and also the continued resistance to the dehumanizing empires, including the church. This is where I insist on focusing on multiple narratives of faith do not necessarily subscribe to the institutional practice of the church or mission agencies. Let me bring one example here. In 1851, there arose a movement for equality and justice in Samoa by the indigenous islander missionaries. They demanded for allowances and wages, just like the Western missionaries. This resulted in some islander missionaries being dispelled and others disciplined. Church historians label this whole episode as native rebellion against European missionaries. They failed to see the indigenous rightful claim for justice and equality. Such stories need to be restored, where alternative dissenting memories of the indigenous multitude are celebrated and reclaimed. And this has to be, I mean, this is an ongoing process. There are many students who undertake researches that address these questions. I will come to that at the end of my presentation. Here, maybe to add a kind of a footnote, I am reminded of an Indian Christian theologian, M.M. Thomas, who once said, "What is real church history? It is not the history of its popes and archbishops. No, not at all. It is the history of people who, filled with the vision of a redeemed church, created strife and division within the church. It is the history of its heretics excommunicated, of its infidels martyred for causing revolution in the church." Unquote. Such alternatives memories of the multitude should find their right place in our restoring of Christianities in the Pacific. The second pointers, the possible pathway, is restoring Pacific church history as embodying people's lived stories as contrary to the text or archive-based mission narratives. Maori writer Patricia Grace argues that the Eurocentric texts and archival documents are hazardous and dangerous to the people in the Pacific. She lists out 4 important reasons for why she thinks that these texts, archival documents, can be hazardous, are hazardous. Number one, they do not reinforce our values, actions, customs, culture, and identity. Number two, when they tell us only about others, they are saying that we do not exist. They write us, but writing things which are untrue. They are writing about us, but saying negative and insensitive things which tell us that we are not good. If you look at the historiography or the archival historical missionary documents, there is no dearth for examples to prove these or to substantiate these this statement made by Patricia. This critique of the European text calls us to search for extra archival documents, especially in an indigenous context of the Pacific. The recognition that the archives are contaminated and distorted must lead us to explore different possibilities of breaking the archival walls. Listening to the silences of indigenous people within the archives is one such possibility to break those walls. So, therefore, we can identify these sources as authentic documents for our restorying history of Christianity or histories of Christianities. This even demands the necessity to extend the archival space, moving away or by considering extra archival documents or even breaking the archival walls. So I would like to state here an example of a research done by a researcher from recently done in my department, Reverend Clark Stewart, as a part of his MTS thesis. Identifying the colonial framework of church history in his island, in his context, the researcher took an indigenous relational approach to restory the history of his own church. Digging into the archival documents enabled him to see texts that are so dehumanizing and negating the subjectivity of the people of his island. Just to give one example from many archival documents he has used, he problematized John Turner's views about the indigenous people of the Pacific. Turner wrote, "To this day, some of the people are still led on by native religious pretenders into all sorts of extravagances and absurdities. The blind literally lead the blind, and both, when they die, falling into the ditch. A feature of poor, corrupt, sin-loving humanity, which, alas, is not peculiar to Samoa, but to every island in the Pacific." By problematizing such colonial representation of the Pacific people, the researcher Clark Stewart restories the history of education in Samoa by embodying people's lived stories in his research. Such passionate restoring has the potential to change the narratives of Pacific church history. I see that the time is running. So let me come to the last pointer of my presentation: restoring Pacific church history as decolonial and anti-racist manifestation. Finally, I would like to share a pedagogical method to restore colonial historiography of Christianity in the Pacific or in a colonized context. Let me use here a colonial archival representation of church history, which can depict pretty well what the church history has been predominantly. This picture is one of the most famous Bible illustrations of a British artist, Harold Copping, who painted it for the London Missionary Society in 1915, with the title, "The Hope of the World." The historiography of Christianity tells us that the Christian stories have often, if not always, been presented as the triumphalist stories of hope that was transplanted from Europe to hopeless parts of the world. This is a colonial representation of world history, which is Eurocentric, imperialistic. Therefore, there is a need to decolonize or restory such stories. I would like to affirm and assert how such a process of decolonization be happening at the beginning of itself. It always has been an anti-racist movement. So the pictorial representation seen and interpreted against its purpose and agenda, multi-dimensional story of colonial Christianity. Herald copying obviously gives a white or British European expose of Christianity in this portrayal that he for MS, which today is an archival document. This is the best example colonial white Christianity. It reflects Eurocentric Christianity that is transplanted in the missionized world of multiple races, religions, ethnicities, and cultures. And you can see the white man burden very well depicted, reflected in this picture. And seen from the people's point of view, we will be able to witness the forgotten stories of Christianity that such historical encounters were always subverted and decolonized by the subaltern and indigenous communities around the world. No doubt that Christianity was presented in subaltern and indigenous worlds like in India, Africa, Oceania, Latin America, and elsewhere as a white Christianity. But what really mattered at the subaltern worlds after Christianized becomes really crucial and significant. In a conversion space in the non-white locations, more than the whiteness of Christianity, the messianic politics of Christian movement matter to the missionized. So just to give the context of colonized Pacifica, where colonialism, racism, and slavery threatened the indigenous life world, the gospel of Christ became an anti-colonial, anti-racist tool in their own liberation. Pacifica ecumenical story that coincided the movement in the Pacific is the best example for that. To add more example, as Gardner shows in her research, how Christianity in Vanuatu became itself a decolonial movement in its own history. So this is the way of restoring the colonial representations of history of Christianities. One of the ways, perhaps. So let me conclude this rather long presentation. I conclude my presentation with a note of appreciation and hope for the restoring attempts that have been already happening in the Pacific. I want to name two examples here. Number one, there are a number of MTH dissertation and ongoing researches in the Department of History of Christianity in PTC, at least from a few years. These are the works by researchers from different parts of the Pacific, different islands of the Pacific. They try to passionately restore their own denominational or island or ecumenical stories that have been colonized and thus misrepresented in the dominant key texts of church history. Number two, PTC has undertaken a multi-volume research project with the title Restoring Pacifica Christianity. This project envisages to restoring multiple aspects of Pacific from history to mission and from theology to ecumenism. All these are passionately committed decolonial works of restoring Christianity in the Pacific from distinctively indigenous people's perspective. Note of appreciation, and I end my presentation. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, which is a very long presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanaka Vakalevu. Well, we've got lots of time here now for people to give us feedback, questions, and I see from looking at the participants, we've got quite a few people here who do work in religious and church history, so that's fantastic. Different audience perhaps to usual. I also just want to make a point when I thank Gladson that I think this is the first time that we've had a presentation in our webinar series from the Pacific Theological College, and that's also fantastic. I can see here also that there's a lot of crossover, that church history, when we're restoring church history, there's a lot of crossover with other histories as well, so it's not just something that's relevant to religious or church history, but is also very central to the historiography of the Pacific. And those of us who've tried to take a more subaltern perspective to the writing of history. So that's just like to now, if you could just please raise your hand or use the raised hands feature, and remember to unmute yourself if you are making comments. Who would like to start? Don't be shy.
Jackie, there's a question from USP.
Oh, I can't see it actually.
Okay, I can see it. So.
It's not me.
It's not.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's a really worthwhile long-term project. I'm so glad to hear that, you know, just across the road, we are working on similar topics. So I think my question, more than a question, is actually a comment. So you talk about people's history and indigenous multitude, but what I think this kind of approach tends to hide is the fact that there are a lot of fractions within the church, meaning with the term the church, like the community of Christians. And so because another way of expressing people's history is history from below. It's, you know, below, it's of course like a relational term. So the above that you envision are the white missionaries, but we also know that there has been a lot of, you know, indigenous agency in actually missionizing and evangelizing. So I wonder how adding all these complexities and, let's say, social divisions within the indigenous communities complicates your idea of people's history from below. And frankly, whether or not like the term multitude is a good one. I have serious problems with Tony Negri and all this lot, so happy to talk about it more, maybe over Kawa. Thank you.
Gladson, have you got a comment to make?
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very valid observation and comment, and I would certainly subscribe to what you to your concern. In fact, I also do not deny that there are complex frictions and fractions within the indigenous worldview and indigenous restoring projects, whatever you call it. We have to address that. I was a bit conscious not to bring those complexities intentionally, perhaps because of my, as I gave the, you know, in the very beginning, but I'm really equally critical about that. Thank you for highlighting that. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions coming up on the chat screen. So does any other comments?
Question from Christine Weir there, Jackie.
Oh, okay. I can't see it.
No, sorry. That's because I wasn't. I couldn't find the hand signal, which is a bit incompetent of me, but there we are. Thank you, Gladson. I thought that was a really interesting presentation, and I think I'd probably frame it slightly differently. I think how I would see the historiography of the Pacific churches and Pacific Christians is perhaps a more continuous change. Perhaps I'm coming slightly to the defense of John Garrett, who I think actually was one of the first people to put an indigenous voice in. So if you compare him with earlier historians, he is moving the way you want to go. I think, in fact, many of the things that you're describing are happening. And it's part of a much wider trend in historiography towards a voice from below, a subaltern voice, an indigenous voice, a look at dissent. I think I could see your project as following actually a trend which has been happening for the past 30 years, and I'm very glad to see you're continuing it.
Gladson, do you have any reactions to that?
Yes, just to thank you for that observation. In fact, I definitely do not claim that this is a new project or a new way of looking at history. Definitely not. But I do not know in which way, perhaps the space that John Garrett's volumes give to the indigenous missionaries, that's what perhaps the way you are looking at that. I still have a trouble with that, that I don't see it as that can become a people's, can be labeled as a people's perspective or a people-centered revisioning of history. So, I mean, sorry, go ahead, please.
I'm not saying that it is, but I think it's the first step towards one.
Okay, thank you very much. I understand.
It's inadequate in your terms, certainly, but nonetheless, there are more Indigenous voices there than there are in earlier ones, and he certainly thought he was that was new. I mean, those of us who are older knew him, and therefore I think maybe the journey starts there, but it was only a first step. Okay. Does that help?
Yes, very much. Yeah, thank you so much for the clarification. I understand your point. And even Forman, for example, Forman also, I was just having his one booklet talking about mission and colonialism. So I don't mean to say that it's a new way. There was already beginning. I think we are just moving forward. Perhaps, thank you very much. Yes.
And this has been expanded over the last 30 years. Particularly, I think, with insights from anthropology.
Yeah. We've got a couple of comments coming on that sort of lead on from there, thanking Gladson for the presentation, but pointing out that Indigenous missionary histories have been written in Indigenous languages, not just in colonial languages. And these are listed down here in the chat section, in the comments section.
All my blood meds. Drinking this before bed lowers blood pressure by 26 points. If you're struggling with...
Please turn your radio off if you've got one on. Thank you. Nice intervention there. Also, Judy Flores from Guam talking, saying about research on Guam that relates to some of the questions that you've raised. Missionary texts are very sparse with information, while our oral histories are rich in local agency regarding the same events. Thank you for your presentation. Just on that note, I've just been sort of, and it perhaps goes back to the comments coming from the beginning from USP, but when I started doing Pacific history, I was working in labour history, and I found that labour history and Marxists of the day were very loath to incorporate religious or Christian perspectives into that. So it sort of works the other way too, where you can find that that you get sort of these large gaps or large perspectives missing when you take one approach. I'm also reminded here of Robert Nicole's work, which looks at resistance and incorporates spirituality with other forms of resistance and subaltern perspectives. Do we have any other? Gillian, you've got a question.
Just have to unmute here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you, Gladson. I found it really interesting. My research is on the early Tahitian mission history, so it's quite pertinent to what I am doing. But I wondered if you could elaborate on the in the reStorying project on the place of those voices who opposed the Christian mission in the Pacific. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is one of my learnings from my students. In fact, I have worked on predominantly, Indian church history, and that was one of my focuses to look at the dissenting voices, not only in India but also in the as well. The People's History of Christianity does exactly that. It brings in dissenting gender voices, queer voices, and multiple other voices. So this is just an exploration and suggestion that this is a space which is not worked on in the context of Pacific. There are few examples, as I gave you one of the examples from one of our students who are researching in the Western Samoan context, where the indigenous missionaries demand for equal wage, or at least some wages for their work, was condemned as revolt or rebellion. So this is just a pointer that I was making, that certain things are certainly maybe visible elsewhere as well. As Jacqueline was mentioning, Robert Nicole's work as a resistance, perhaps inside and outside the church. This is an area that the church historians in the Pacific perhaps have to look carefully at. Not that I have examples, but I'm just making an assumption that certainly there may be just one or two examples that I have, but not a lot. That makes me feel that there is a gap, and this has to be identified. And that's what I meant. Is it helpful?
Yeah, thank you. I've in my research of missionary letters themselves, I've come across instances where there were actual rebellions against the missionaries that were taking place in Tahiti in the early 1820s.
Great.
And also the daughter of one of the missionaries as well, which is what I'm looking at. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I was interested to see what else is happening in that area.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
We have a question coming here from Wandale Ramia. Sorry, I pronounced that wrong again, but I actually can't read it very well either. And it's a question that I was wondering about too, which is on breaking the archival wall. I've used the term from Anne Stoller, reading against the grain in the archives. And I know that a long time in the Pacific History Association, we've had historians from many different angles reading or rereading archives to find those silent voices and lost voices. So the information can be there. But is that different to breaking the archival wall?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a result of one of my research with the German mission agency. So from my PhD, I've been working on the German mission agencies, and I had to locate myself in those archives, and the classification systems of the documents, or even the the entry into the archives, they all speak to us some conspiracy around these documents and mission histories. And in order to make sense of what those documents really talk about or speak, we may have to go beyond what is archived there. Let me give you an example. This is not an example from the Pacific, as I said. I have to admit that my work on the Pacific church history is very limited. But from my other work outside the Pacific, let me give you an example. I worked on the women missionaries, Indian women missionaries, who worked along with the German missionaries, women missionaries. And there are certain letters written by Indian women missionaries, and that was translated to German language. And in the process of translation, which is found, which finds a place in the archives today, there's a lot of politics of omission, which I call it. So there is an intentional omission happens during the process of translation. And what happens, I mean, if you rely on the translation alone, or even the letter written by the missionary woman herself, I think you end up in making a, making a biased judgments. So what I did was, I visited those villages. I mean, the grandchildren. I had a conversation, and this is the way I moved out of the archives. And that's one of the ways. And also there are, for example, the pictures that are not recorded in the mission archives, but with the family people. So they all tell us a holistic story, or rather towards the holistic story of that particular episode or an individual. So I think this is what I meant by breaking the archival wall, or in the sense, moving out of the archival space, the limited or the colonially constructed archival walls.
Thank you. Mary Cook has got a long comment here, which I'll try and summarize if I can read it. Again, thank you for your presentation. I would be very interested to hear more Indigenous perspectives regarding the nuances between different denominations of missionaries in the Pacific. In the Society Islands, where you have the European power struggle of English Protestants versus French Catholics playing out on an Antipodean stage. From the Christian perspective, these denominations are so different, but I wonder how different they would be actually seen from an outside perspective, such as that of an Indigenous Tahitian. And Mary asks, does anyone have any resources that might be available to explore the question further? So that's not really just for Gladson, that's for some of you who are working in more specialised areas. And the works of Taonga, Ron Crocombe and Marjorie Crocombe would be a good start. Yeah. Helen?
Yeah, thanks so much, Gladson. I found that absolutely fascinating. All sorts of interesting ideas there. I hesitate to ask this question because it's one more colonial voice in this seminar. I'm really feel like we should be hearing more from, or look forward to hearing more from the Pacifica people. And perhaps this is a reference, this speaks to this. Why is it, do you think, that the churches or the missions decolonised in the 60s and the 70s as the nations decolonised, but the histories didn't? What have you got do you have an, I mean, what are the broader structural issues at play here, do you think? Let's see.
Sorry, Helen, I'm sorry, I did not get this last section of your question. Can you please repeat if you don't mind?
Okay, so the main thrust of my question is, why do we think, can you imagine, or do you think that while the missions decolonised in the 1960s, 1970s, as the colonies decolonised and became nations, the histories didn't decolonise, really? What are the structural issues that you can identify here, perhaps, to speak to the failure of decolonisation?
Do you mean decolonisation of the intellectual and academic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's really, I think, really a difficult question. In fact, Helen, I do not have an answer, but I think even today, except, I mean, I don't say except, but many of the local theological colleges here in the Pacific, the framework of history still remains the same. This kind of thinking is mainly happening within the, in the PTC and the graduates from here. So I think that the decolonial approach or a passion, I don't want to offend, because this is the problem that I might end up offending somebody, but I really do not know. And for the past many years, I've been told that the teachers here in the Pacific are German historians teaching here, and they never encouraged this kind of thinking. And so this kind of structural problems I get here. So rather I keep quiet with that comment, and I just let us to imagine what might have happened.
If I could just make a comment here, because I have offended historians in the past, and I think if we're going back looking at the writing of history, we need to look at where some of that writing has come from, and the domination of certain institutions in Australia and New Zealand that will remain nameless, that may have had implications for the way that real decolonisation of historiography might have come about. But that's just my two thoughts. But we do have a comment from someone who's now at ANU, who is Annie Kwai, and she's wondering about Indigenous feminine agencies, what that might look like from your work on behind the archival wall. I mean, there certainly are people, as we all know, there are people who are working on Indigenous feminine agencies, but sometimes one of the issues that comes up here is that Indigenous feminine agencies may actually be reinforcing the status quo as well. That's certainly something I've found in supervision. But Gladson, do you have any thoughts on feminism or feminist agencies from an Indigenous perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much. I can certainly talk from my research location, from Indian point of view, not from the Pacific perspective. The Indigenous or the Native Women Agency is one of the complex in terms of their contribution towards both colonial framework of mission and also to a larger extent, also redeeming the colonial clutches, in fact. I give you some examples. There were Indigenous or the Native women missionaries who were trying to move beyond or even challenging the colonial structures of the mission agencies. In fact, maybe this is important. This may be interesting to share with you. The title of my book, if you can see, the book 2015 is Mode of Mutuality in the Margins of Mission. The mode of mutuality, the word mutuality I used in order to depict, in order to present the interaction that happened or a new identity that emerged as a result of the interaction between the Indian native women and missionary European women. So they to certain extent, I'm not, there is a problem of glorifying, so please be mindful of that. But there were examples where the women agency, the Native women agencies helped the European women missionaries as well as male missionaries to move beyond their constructed framework of Christian mission and Christian theologies. So that is where I would say, at least from the context where I worked on the mission histories, there are examples where feminist agencies, they contributed a lot towards perspectival changes in terms of mission history and mission theologies.
Thank you. We've got a question here from you Tuanalu.
Yep, it's all right, Jackie.
Sorry,
can you hear me all right?
Wasn't sure where that was coming from.
Yeah. Look, my name is Ewan. I'm coming to you from New Zealand, and I'm hoping my internet sort of holds up. Thank you very much, Gladstone, for that illuminating talk. And I'm just thinking about 19th century Samoa, where you did mention something in 1851, where LMS native missionaries, what they were called native missionaries, sort of demanded a more of a recognition of their role. And one of the problems is that you've got a number of competing sort of systems there, and of course the people that are writing the archives, of course, are doing the job of interpreting that relationship. And the difficulty that I've got is that sometimes some of the Samoan texts that we've been able to find, which are few and far between, but they exist in terms of letters complaining about various things, you know, in forums that are other than the missionary ones, that they tend to adopt the same terms, on the surface of it anyway, the same terms and the same language that that, for want of a better word, that the oppressors have sort of used on top of them. So it's a double whammy in that you've got to get underneath the skin of the Samoans. And of course, I don't know what a 19th century Samoan would be thinking and doing. And but of course, you've got these ideas, and you're tracing ideas going back. So in my case, it was using I'm still doing this thing, using a Pacific concept of va, and trying to trace back through the 20th century usages of it, looking for 19th century stuff, and then tracing it through. So that's the type of thing that I'm doing in terms, and I'm not saying that I'm the only one. There are other theologians, etc., that are incorporating what would you call it, more friendly sort of notions of Christian theology to merge the two worlds a little closer to one another. So just a comment, Gladstone, but in terms of what Pacific people are doing, and you've got somebody there, Wanda Yeremia, who's been making comments rather than speaking on the on her microphone, because it doesn't work, but she's doing some really interesting stuff there as well, because she's tracked down the source, what is it, the Sulu La Mipa, the Sulu, which is the LMS missionary newsletter, or that, what is it, goes back to 1840s or something like that, and it's written in Samoan. So she's going to be coming up with some really interesting things there. But for me, of course, the stuff that she's been letting go in the Facebook, you've got this language that seems to be talking about the same sorts of things that the European missionaries have been talking about, but it's discerning those layers that are particular to indigenous people, which I gather you're doing with the Indian experience as well. So thank you very much, Gladstone. I realize I'm taking up too much time, but it's ended up being more of a comment than a question. So thank you.
No, that's really really useful. Gladson, did you have anything to respond to that, or?
No, I just wanted to thank you for that comment. Thank him for the comment. You know, it's really helpful. Thank you.
Now, are there any other comments or questions? I can't seem to be, my screen's gone a wee bit wonky at the moment, but Helen, can you see any other comments?
No, I can't see any. I think nobody else has any other questions.
Okay, well, in that case, I'd really like to thank you. I've got a couple of announcements to make, but first of all, Gladson, we're all really, really delighted that you've kicked off our webinar series. It's great to have someone coming in from a different, I wouldn't say different part of the world, because you're in the Pacific now, so you are of the Pacific, but I think it really helps to have refreshing angles looking at these questions. So once again, thank you very much. And are you going to be staying in Suva, or are you moving on, Gladson?
For a few weeks, yes, I'm going to stay here in Suva.
Yeah, I was just doing a bit of research on the internet, so yeah, I just wondered. And also thank you for bearing with us, because Vodafone Fiji has not been the most cooperative in terms of bandwidth, and our ability to be able to hear sometimes. So those slides were really useful too. We could read them when we couldn't always hear you so clearly. But that's one of the issues that we deal with when we're having these Trans-Pacific webinars. Now, on the 12th of August, Nicholas Hoare is going to be talking about mining futurities, imagined futures for the Pacific from 3 great phosphate islands. So we're shifting in a different sort of direction, but I'd really like to invite you all to take part in that webinar, and there will be an announcement made very soon on the PHA web page and also on our Facebook page. So I hope, Helen, that you get better soon, or you're on the way to recovery. And once again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.